Of the 5 ways of proving the existence of God that Thomas Aquinas presents in the Summa Theologia, the third way has perhaps the clearest structure. Having said that, there are aspects of it that are far from clear to the modern reader. As a consequence, it is subject to the same level of misrepresentation as the other ways. We will need to begin by clarifying some of the terms that this argument relies on before presenting a more faithful rendering that doesn't fall foul of the standard objections. We will cover each of the steps in this video, but feel free to pause to contemplate what Thomas Aquinas is saying. I have been quite mischievous myself, in fact. From the beginning of this series, I have been promising to cover the argument from Contingency. I use that label because it is a common label to use for the third way. However, Thomas does not use the term contingent. He uses the term possible. He says, "The third way is taken from possibility and necessity." In fact, he is interested specifically in the possibility of a substance existing or not existing. For he says, "We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be." In other words, anything that comes into being and goes out of being is possible. Thomas is not a proponent of the view that everything that is possible will come into being at some point. And that's important to note because he draws a distinction between what is logically possible and what is naturally possible. The set of things that are logically possible is greater than the set of things that are naturally possible. The set of logically possible things contains every possibility, and naturally possible does not. For example, it is logically possible for the wood to be on fire and to be cold. The wood has those attributes logically, but it is not naturally possible for the wood to have those properties at the same time. Thomas is talking primarily about possibility in the physical and natural sense in this argument, rather than the logical sense. For he goes on to say, "But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible not to be, at some time is not." If it were the case that that which is possible was never in the state of not being, it would be necessary. In other words, it would not be possible for it to not be, or its not being would not be possible. But even here, Thomas wants to draw a distinction, because like Aristotle before him, he does believe in substances that are naturally necessary. That is to say, they are incorruptible, yet they are not self-sufficient. He says, "Every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not." And this is the part that some commentators seem to ignore, even though it is clearly part of the argument. Thomas believes that naturally necessary substances do exist, but they rely on something else for their being. So he distinguishes between natural necessity and absolute necessity. We should note, of course, that Aquinas and Aristotle were wrong about the heavenly bodies being necessary. We know that they did come into being, and will go out of being just as the things of the earth will. But it is still important to acknowledge that Thomas makes this distinction between natural and absolute necessity, because it means that he cannot be making the claim that some people accuse him of making. For he briefly appears to claim that there can be no infinite regress. For he says, "Now it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proved in regard to efficient causes. If the heavenly bodies are necessary, they exist infinitely in time at least. Therefore we can assume that he must believe that infinite regress is possible. And given what we know about what is possible, it can be or not be, which means that it relies on something else for its existence." As convoluted as this sounds, this is actually a crucial distinction to make. What Thomas is ultimately positing here is the existence of necessary substances that are logically possible, although he never defines them in this way. The naturally possible substances come in and out of existence. The naturally necessary substances do not, but it is logically possible that they not exist. And this is crucial if we want to introduce the idea of contingency. Contingency applies to all of the naturally possible and naturally necessary substances. They are contingent because they all rely upon that which is absolutely necessary for their existence. For Thomas says, "Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. And thus, even now nothing would be in existence, which is absurd." This move receives significant criticism. Criticism that is particularly poignant when applied to the structure of this argument above the others. It is often said of Aquinas, even among Thomists, that he has made a logical error here. It is called the Fallacy of Composition. It is to say that just because all observed entities in the universe are contingent, it does not necessarily follow that the universe as a whole is contingent. However, I believe Thomas anticipated this objection. It might explain why he carefully distinguishes between the naturally possible and the naturally necessary among contingent things. In other words, even if he acknowledges that the heavenly bodies are naturally possible substances, like everything else, he still posits the existence of at least one naturally necessary substance, the universe itself. If at one time the universe did not exist, it could not bring itself into being, and thus even now nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. We have come across this theme in Thomas's previous cosmological arguments. It is the idea that infinite regresses are possible. The universe could be infinite, but this is only possible if they are conceived of within the context of pure being. In the first way, pure being was described as pure act. In the second way, pure being was essential causality. And in the third way, it is absolute necessity. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God.